And welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen, Clavio, Scott Caulfield joining you. It is the 5th of October, Sunday morning, as we're on a bye week, Scott, for Indiana football and getting ready for what is really perhaps the biggest game of the college football season coming up this upcoming week, as Indiana will be traveling to Oregon. But we get a week off.
With that said, where's game day going to be?
It's going to be in Eugene.
Oh, is it? Okay, sorry. I didn't know. I was waiting for you. Like, oh, let's go to Oxford. So
Scott was not. Scott was out doing social adult things last night, so he's missed some of the news. But yes, if you missed it, Indiana and Oregon, that's going to be the game day game. It's going to be out in Eugene. That'll be a fascinating way to start that day because they're going to have to start the show at like 6 a.m. local time. So, but I'll be out there. I know a bunch of people are going out there. It's going to be a pretty fascinating environment as Indiana, a top 10 team, certainly this week. We don't know where yet. The ratings have not yet dropped as of the recording of this episode, but they'll be taking on an Oregon team that might be the best in the country. And, you know, we'd love to get game day here in Bloomington, but anytime you can be a part of game day in general, you're doing pretty well. And as was noted, this is the fourth game day Indiana's been involved in the last 13 games.
We are now, that's wild. By the way, that stat is wild. We are now, like, it used to be you and I joking about like us ever being on game day.
Right.
We're now getting to the point where when's the first time the bison head will be donned on game day? Because I mean, like now this is the first time we've been on game day since we've had a mascot. Like now we can partake in this where we can get picked. I don't know if anyone's going to pick us to win this game, so probably not. But we're getting close to, Hoosier the Bison being on game day.
I know. It's and Hoosier the Bison starting to become more part of the scene. There was a great event that happened here in Bloomington earlier this week as IU hosted Hoosier Hoops on Kirkwood in partnership with the Upstairs Pub and with Home Field Apparel. I mean, it was a pretty cool event. I was out there for that. They had a half-court basketball court set up on Kirkwood Avenue, but we had Hoosier the Bison up at Upstairs tending bar for a little bit. It's cool seeing an actual mascot with IU going out and doing mascot things. It's very much just part of the landscape now. And after all these years of not having the mascot, it's cool to just see the mascot out in these locations.
That Kirkwood thing was awesome. Like, it was all over social media. It looked cool. I was talking to a friend about it like a couple days ago. It's just like, man, that was like, it's just cool to see IU doing like cool new things that look like fun. And he's just like, yeah, like, damn, man, Woodson sucked. It's like, he would have never done that. And it's like, because I was joking about like the spot where DeVries is like just ordering a next round of drinks on me, and it's like that's cool. Like, I mean, it doesn't equate to anything wins and losses, but it's just like it's a cool vibe for IU.
Yeah, and it's a necessary one. And we talked about this a bunch back in the spring about needing to reestablish that connection between fans and the team,
right?
Which I think for a lot of people who aren't in Bloomington or haven't been around, you might be like, I don't know what you're talking about, but it was palpable here at the games and just in terms of the way that the relationship between the students and the team, the relationship between alums and the team, it really deteriorated. And that's not one person's fault. I think that was a culmination of a lot of events over the last 25 years, maybe even longer than that. But you can't keep taking that for granted, and I don't think Indiana's taking it for granted anymore. And so that's nice to see. And I think, it wasn't just the buying the round of shots at the end, like listening to DeVries act like a hype man before the event was happening, getting out there on the mic. I've never heard him quite like that. That was cool to hear. Terry Morin up on the balcony addressing the crowd below from the open windows there at the Upstairs Pub. I mean, the whole thing was really cool. And look, there weren't like tens of thousands of people there, but that's not really the point.
Right.
A lot of what you've seen, and when we're talking with people in and around the event, a lot of what we've seen with Hoosier hysteria, it's just, I would make the argument like IU's never really truly done that event the way that the meta build of that event really looks nationwide. Like you normally look at Kentucky's or Kansas's or whatever. When Bob Knight was here, which was when you and I were here, it was just like they came out and practiced. And, it was at midnight because it had to be, and everybody was, at that point, it was like, well, this is just how we do things here. And then as IU's tried to get on the cooler side of things, it's appealed to some folks and not others, but the attendance had waned quite a bit. So this is a nice change of pace. They had a scrimmage the next night. I did not get a chance to make that myself, but trying to do these things to bring the basketball team to the public does matter. And
I liked in a weird way, like doing it outside of it. Like everything has been obviously a home game in Assembly Hall. Like it's like bringing it outside and incorporating some of the other cool features of IU was really cool because it's a completely different vein, but it's like when Michigan State would play those games on an aircraft carrier. It's just like, whoa, like, I mean, doesn't matter. It's like, that's just different. Like, it's wow, they're willing to try anything to get, to get noticed. And I like that. So,
yeah. So it's something we'll continue to talk about as it is October. We are going to have basketball live games that we can talk about within a couple of weeks. Indiana men's and women's basketball have exhibition games. And of course, IU, one of those games is a game against Baylor for an exhibition in Gainbridge. Those things don't mean that much. Indiana played Tennessee last year and
won, right?
Won that game at Thompson Bowling Arena. Those two teams had very different destinies as the season went along. But it'll be nice to see this team as a unit and how they're able to perform against another team that has a pulse. And then, of course, the start of November, you'll have the start of the season. So a lot going on just in general with IU sports. What we wanted to do with today's show, since there's no game to talk about and it's a little early yet, to really do some honest-to-God previews of IU Oregon. We're going to save that for later on in the week. But we wanted to first talk about the Big Ten as a whole and what we know going into this next week of play for Indiana. You're almost at the halfway point with the season. What does the rest of the Big Ten look like in comparison to Indiana? For Indiana's goal of winning a Big Ten title, for Indiana's goal of getting back to the college football playoff, what's it look like within the conference? Also wanted to talk about this news that got floated earlier on this week about the Big Ten having a proposal in place to do a partnership with private equity to consolidate media rights, extend the conference's grant of rights. There's a lot of different things there that we should probably dive into. There's also all this stuff with Cody Campbell, this television ad that got pulled that was supposed to run this week. There's just a lot of stuff that we're going to talk about. So we're going to dive all that in just a second. Just a quick reminder, first of all, though, we are brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs, and, of course, Home Field Apparel on their nationwide tour for college football. They've continued to pump out amazing football apparel in general. A lot of new hats out there. Did you get one of the new hats, Scott?
I did not, but I've seen them. They look good.
Yeah, they look great. They just put out some new Idaho apparel, which looks so ridiculous that you probably want to purchase it. Like there's one of a guy in a potato costume. It's
anybody who's had a cup of coffee with the NCAA football games, EA Sports,
yes,
has gotten into Idaho at some point, just based on their stadium.
It's true. Yes, that weird low slung roof. You can go to Home Field Apparel and use the code HOME23, get 15% off your first order. And if you're in Bloomington, you can go to Home Field at Tracks and get a very curated, very, very IU-centric look at Home Field's lineup. You can also find Home Field Apparel in stores throughout Central and Southern Indiana. So again, homefieldapparel.com, proud sponsor of the Back Home Network. Speaking of the Back Home Network, you should subscribe to us on YouTube. Just search Back Home Network on YouTube, get alerts whenever we go live or when we release a new podcast. And you can also subscribe on Substack, which is where you can go if you wanted to make a financial contribution, for lack of a better term, to the show. We certainly appreciate it. Helps us keep the lights on a bit. But join us in one of the subscriber settings. We'd love to have you there. It helps not just you find our stuff, but it helps your friends find us. And if you've got friends or family that aren't aware of any of the shows on the Back Home Network or CrimsonCast in particular, let them know, but you can also let them know indirectly by helping to get us into your algorithm a little bit more.
Yeah, do it now before we start taking private equity money. Like, right. We really blow up and the subscribers are no longer approved.
That's the PE deal for the Back Home Network is going to be pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's move forward and figure out what we are talking about with the rest of the conference by looking at the current state of affairs. And, from Indiana's perspective, I guess first and foremost, we're still waiting on the updated rankings and resume materials, at least in terms of S&P Plus. But we do know this week that IU is a little further up in the mix in terms of FPI. That is already out. FPI, of course, is ESPN's College Football Power Index.
That's the one they don't take into consideration when they're doing their own bowl projections.
It's the one they don't take into consideration unless it's supporting an SEC team.
Right,
Yes.
right. Like they use that when it's good for SEC, and they don't use it when it's not.
It's a fascinating approach that they take. But no, the FPI ratings for this week are more of the same to some degree when it comes to the overall setup of college football. Teams 2, 3, and 4. Excuse me. No, my bad. Teams 1, 2, and 4 are all members of the Big Ten. Ohio State, the number 1 overall team in FPI. Oregon, the second. I'm going to call this sheet up here. And then Indiana is 4th. And you go down the list, USC is 10th, Michigan's 12th, Penn State drops to 19th. Then you get Nebraska, Washington, Illinois, and Iowa, all those teams in the top 35 of FPI. So, what we wanted to do was kind of go through not just the ratings of these teams, but talk about, who's going to be Indiana's biggest obstacles in terms of getting to the Big Ten title game or getting to the college football playoff within the conference. Obviously, there's stuff outside the conference that we'll talk about on different podcasts. But, Scott, when you look at those top 3 teams in FPI in the Big Ten, Ohio State at this point projected to go 11-1. But you add up the numbers, they could easily go 12-0 given their projections. They're a 23.5% chance of winning out. Oregon also projected to go 11-1, and they were number 1 in FPI last week. Ohio State looked so good against Minnesota, and Oregon's win against Penn State looked somewhat less impressive after what happened with Penn State. They ended up dropping to 2nd, and then Indiana moves up 1 spot. Indiana still essentially projected to go somewhere between 10-2 and 11-1 with a 6.3% chance of winning out. Now, we have to look at it from the standpoint of the schedules first and foremost, Scott. And when you think about the schedules, obviously the top of the Big Ten doesn't necessarily play each other, and that creates some curiosities. Same thing in the SEC, obviously. But if you look at Ohio State, for instance, Ohio State does not play Oregon, does not play Indiana. Their remaining games, and they have some that look a bit difficult. At Illinois, they've got Penn State at home, although that doesn't look as tough now. And then they close the season at Michigan. They have other games mixed in there as well. But those are kind of the 3 games they've got against contending teams. Oregon, we know, already beat Penn State. They get Indiana at home this upcoming week. And I tell you, outside of a trip to Iowa and a trip to Washington, and I guess they host USC, that might be a little tricky, but they don't have the top-end opponents the rest of the way. Indiana, of course, at Oregon, at Penn State, and they've got some games that look like they might be a little tricky, like traveling to Maryland. But again, they don't have a whole lot of really top-end games remaining outside of the 2 that we just talked about. And then with USC, they've got Michigan at home. They got to go to Notre Dame. They got to go to Oregon. Those feel like the if you want to throw Michigan into the mix, I'm still not entirely sure what to make of Michigan. Michigan's schedule also pretty simple. They go to USC, they go to Maryland, they have Ohio State at home to close the season. You could make an argument Michigan might have the easiest of the remaining pathways, all things considered, outside of that Ohio State game, but they get that at home. So you look at the Big Ten, and the Big Ten has a lot of good teams, and most of them look like they have a chance to finish somewhere between 10-2 and 12-0. From what you've seen, just kind of in terms of the games and the way that they played and the personnel, like, who do you look at as the top contenders or the top teams that might give IU trouble moving forward?
So there's 2 ways, two versions of this. So let's save the college football playoff for second and just look at like Big Ten and Big Ten title games. And I'll caveat this with, I wouldn't have chalked up a loss by Penn State at UCLA this weekend. Right. So I mean, things are, the chance that it's going to chalk out the whole way is probably unlikely. I don't want to sit here on the show and be like, well, I think for Michigan, their toughest opponent is going to be, but when you look at it, and especially from IU's perspective, I do think this weekend is massive for us and our chance to make the Big Ten title game because of this. That you look at Ohio State and Michigan, like you laid out, they both look pretty good that they might be undefeated going into that game when Ohio State plays Michigan, and that game is at Ohio State. So that feels like that is one of Michigan and Ohio State will have one of the spots in the Big Ten title game. And then that leaves kind of Indiana and Oregon. And it looks like Oregon could go clean after they play Indiana. And if you assume those things, if Michigan, Ohio State, and Oregon all win the rest of their games outside of Michigan and Ohio State playing each other, it's like there's no room for Indiana if they lose to Oregon. So it feels to me like this is, unless one of those teams stumbles along the way, it feels like if Indiana doesn't win this game against Oregon, I'm not sure they have a way into the Big Ten title game. That's how I view it right now.
Well, and as you pointed out, the idea that this is all just going to go chalk the rest of the way is probably not accurate. But look, I think what you're bringing up some good points. I mean, ultimately, it's just a numbers game. And this is why I've really gotten tired of the arguments about where you finish in a conference or what your conference record is, because the schedules are very uneven, and that's kind of the point of this exercise to some degree.
Right. Well, that's the thing too. Like, I want to be very clear. It's like, if we lose to Oregon and then we win out and we go 11-1 and we don't make the Big Ten title game, like, I'm not disappointed at all. I mean, damn, that sucks. Like, it'd be fun to be in there, but it's like, that's awesome. That means you had a great season. That means that Michigan, Ohio State, and Oregon also had really unbelievable seasons. And it's like, I'll take 11-1 with a win at Penn State all day long. So, just get that on the record. I just saying, for us trying to get to the Big Ten title game, it looks like if we don't beat Oregon, we're going to need probably 2 more UCLA Penn State type results the rest of this season happening to Michigan. I mean, it has to happen to Oregon, and then it has to happen to whoever ends up being the eventual winner of the Ohio State Michigan game.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say this. First of all, to me, so far, I think that you could make a really good argument for either Oregon or Ohio State being the best team in the country.
Yeah.
They do different things very well. Ohio State's defense has just looked absolutely dominant. And it's a bit funny if you think about, one of the big storylines from this offseason was Ohio State losing Jim Knowles, their defensive coordinator. He goes to Penn State. Penn State moves on from Tom Allen. That's supposed to be the missing piece in terms of Penn State getting over the hump and competing, not just for a Big Ten championship, but also being able to take that final step towards winning a college football playoff title. And instead, they look like they've gone backwards, particularly in the area of defense. I mean, last year, Penn State finished the season as the 7th best defensive efficiency team in college football. This year, so far, they are 48th in defense in FPI efficiency, which is a crazy drop when you consider how good of a coach Jim Knowles is. Oregon is 3rd in the country in offense, 8th in the country in defense, and Ohio State is 7th on the country in offense and 2nd in the country in defense. Indiana right now, through the first 5 games, is 16th in the country offensively and 4th defensively. So all 3 of these teams are amongst the best in the country in terms of how they've played defense so far on the season. The difference thus far has been that over the course of the 5 games that they've all played, Indiana's offense has not looked quite as efficient. And we've seen bits and pieces of that. Obviously, we saw that in the Iowa game. We saw that in the Old Dominion game. And you could say, well, God, they looked great in the other ones, and that's true. But that's kind of the point, is that all it takes when you're looking at these types of performances is a bad quarter or a few drives that don't get executed properly. What is fascinating about Indiana, though, is they are the 3rd best team in the country, in the conference right now, and the 10th best team overall in special teams play. They've blocked punts. They've gotten a return for a touch, or not a return, but a block for a touchdown. They got a return for a touchdown the first game of the season. that's a nice piece that Indiana's been able to count on that Oregon and Ohio State and USC have not. So that's going to be something worth keeping an eye on as we move forward.
I would also say, and I'm going to walk very gingerly here, but it's like I would say that our schedule probably has been better than Ohio State's thus far. I mean, they have a win against Texas at home. I would venture to say maybe when all's said and done, Illinois is a better team than Texas, and our win looks way better than that one. But you're splitting hairs, but it's like a couple other nothings, and like their road game is Washington. Our road game was Iowa. I look at it as like you might say that right now the slight upper hand of schedule goes to Indiana over Ohio State, probably not over Oregon. But again, you're splitting hairs at this point, and
yeah, there's a couple ways to calculate that. Like if you go by straightforward strength of schedule, Indiana does have the worst of the schedule so far. They're 70th out of this group. Ohio State's 34th, Oregon's 48th, Illinois' 12th, Michigan's 24th, Washington's 33rd, and Nebraska's 69th. That's kind of the top of the Big Ten. But in strength of record, which this is the metric that, again, is only used by the SEC when it supports the SEC and only used by ESPN when it supports the SEC. But strength of record is essentially a metric that you might have remembered us talking about last year that measures the difficulty of a team's record. So basically not just how tough was your strength of schedule, but how difficult or easy would it be for the average top tier team to achieve the exact record against your specific schedule. So the higher the number, or a higher SOR ranking is more impressive or deserving than a lower one. And essentially what that means is it's one thing to go 5-0 against the 70th ranked strength of schedule like Indiana has, but to go 5-0 against that schedule with the scores and the overall margin of victory that Indiana has done, that's what lands Indiana 8th in strength of record overall. Now, again, Ohio State's 3rd, Oregon's 4th, Illinois' 9th, right behind Indiana, Michigan's 17th, and Washington's 21st. That's kind of your top 5 there. So, but you look forward the rest of the way, Indiana's got a slightly tougher schedule than Ohio State. They've got a tougher schedule than Illinois, not by a huge amount, but that's going to be what's going to, like, one of the things that keeps Indiana afloat in this equation is how well they've played statistically and how efficiently they've played. That's going to be the big thing to watch as we move forward. And what keeps Indiana high in these rankings is the fact that what they are doing out there executionally just looks better consistently than the average team does. And this is where I'll take a team like USC, whose strength of record is 34th, and their overall efficiency numbers are not perhaps what you would think they'd be because their defense is so sloppy. They're 61st in the country in defense, so that they give up additional points against a team like Purdue or whoever they're playing. That's why Indiana has been able to maintain such a high standard in these, because they played so efficiently.
So I'm going to throw some things at you now, like in the Big Ten. So let's look at a couple other, like the next tier of teams. So if you look at Illinois, Illinois, to me, it all kind of comes down to their game. They're playing at Ohio State, this weekend. If they win that, we'll play some, if they do that game, it's like the rest of their schedule is at Washington, Rutgers, Maryland, at Wisconsin, Northwestern. They could win out after the win against Ohio State, which would put them in a really interesting spot to get a Big Ten title berth. Yeah. And it would be good for Indiana because they would have, Ohio State would then have a blemish and Indiana would have that against them. Maryland was going great until they lost to Washington. They're also, they could go, if they run clean the rest of the way, which would be a win at Indiana, which I'm not sure they're going to do. A win at home against Indiana, and then at Illinois, and then home against Michigan. They have a tougher road. But with already one loss, I think it's going to be tough for them to go through totally undefeated. The other team we could talk about is Penn State, who, I think people are going to leave for dead now, but they still have, and I was saying this last night to the friends I was with, is like, look, I don't, they're not going to fire Franklin yet, but it's like Franklin's got it. Like if he wins at Ohio State and then beats Indiana, they are literally right back in this thing. I mean, they may not be able to get to a Big Ten title game. They'll be able to get to the CFP, but to me, that's where Penn State, but if Penn State runs the rest of the way here, they will have given Ohio State a loss. They would have given Indiana a loss. They would have knocked Ohio State down a peg. And then it's like, if Michigan beats Ohio State, Penn State would be in the Big Ten title, could be in the Big Ten title game with Oregon, depending on how things play out if they win all the way through. So I don't think Penn State's DOA either. A lot of things have to happen, but what they have that a lot of other teams don't have is, like, a lot of teams we mentioned is like, oh, they have a pretty easy schedule. Penn State doesn't, but that means they have the ability to kind of control their own destiny with wins here.
Well, and I think it's a really key point, is that one of the things that I think people make too many mistakes on too often is something I heard from a lot of IU fans online last night, which was, oh, well, we're going to beat Penn State. Well, I mean, Penn State's still a good team.
Right.
They're not playing particularly well. And at this point, I would think if Indiana was playing to the best of their ability, they would beat Penn State.
Right. But that game's in a month, like when they're not playing well now.
It's in a month. It's also in Happy Valley, a place Indiana has never won. It is very dangerous to start going around saying, oh, yeah, that game's in the can. And as you said, Penn State's got a lot of their own destiny in their hands as they move forward. The idea that they're just going to roll over at this point, I mean, it would be hilarious to watch them finish like 8-4 in a season where they were picked to, be perhaps the best team in the country alongside Clemson. But I just have a hard time seeing that happen. And so I think that if you're an Indiana fan, it's important to kind of pump the brakes a bit on these things, because you don't want to get over your skis. We oftentimes see, even when FPI has started to move in a particular direction in terms of projecting a matchup, we'll oftentimes see a situation where a team will rally. They'll figure out what was good. I mean, that Penn State team, even though they lost to Oregon and lost to UCLA, with both of them, they could have won the games. Drew Aller, if he doesn't throw the interception in overtime, maybe they beat Oregon, or if they go for 2 on that last touchdown they do in regulation. UCLA so misplayed the end of that game that there was a real good chance that Penn State was going to tie the game and send it into overtime, and they didn't execute. Now, right now, Indiana is a 61.4% favorite to win in Happy Valley, which is significantly higher than it was at the beginning of the year. And that's not just the record of Penn State, but it's looking at the way they're playing, they just look really unimpressive on both sides of the ball. They look like a mid-tier Big Ten team, but it's hard to win on the road at mid-tier Big Ten teams. We
just
saw
did
that
in Iowa.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you go through the list the rest of the way. We'll tackle Indiana first, and then I want to go to the individual teams you're talking about. So, one of the things you can do on ESPN's schedule page, if you haven't done this before, is if you go to the schedule of Indiana and then click on like the game time or the box scores, you get the matchup predictor, which is basically the computer saying, okay, looking at the way these two teams are playing, looking at where the game's being played, here's the percentage chance of each win. As we saw last year, it was a pretty accurate portrayal of things. Oregon's still roughly a 70-30 favorite over Indiana in that game that's coming up. Indiana, a 93.4% favorite over Michigan State in the game the week after. With the UCLA win, that win probability is still 97.2% for Indiana when the Bruins come to town. The game at Maryland, it started to creep closer. That's now gotten further apart. Indiana's still an 84% probability to win at Maryland. I mentioned this one just a second ago. Indiana's win probability or win percentage projection for Penn State is 61.4. For the Wisconsin game, it's 91.8%.
Real quick, wait. We're 91% chance to win against Wisconsin. Let's just take a breath and be like, that actually is real. Like, this is happening.
It's hard to really get your head wrapped around. But it's kind of like, you look at that Wisconsin game yesterday that they played against Michigan, and it's like, well, that's a team that clearly can't move the ball, like, against a good defense. And you can say, well, God, it was against Michigan. It's like Michigan's not as good as Indiana, especially defensively. So, yeah. And then the last game of the year, Indiana, even though Purdue has looked better this year, they kind of hung offensively with Illinois throughout the course of that game, but they can't stop anybody, especially through the air. But Indiana's still a 94% favorite against Purdue.
I do love how the Purdue game time has already been set. It's like they can't set things 2 weeks out, but we'll go ahead with November 28th and get that one nailed down.
The joys of doing a game on Black Friday, right?
Yeah.
You know what the windows are. But let's go ahead, and I wanted to dive in the teams that look like the contenders. Ignore the colors here. This was my preseason predictions for the Big Ten. So if you see red, if you're watching on YouTube or Spotify, those are just games I've gotten wrong so far. But you mentioned Illinois. Illinois is a great example of, and I actually need to fill in a little bit more there because they did beat Purdue already. But Illinois has got 6 games left. And as you said, if they can find a way to win against Ohio State at home, which is certainly a possibility, although it would take Illinois looking significantly better than they've looked all season. But if they knock off Illinois or Ohio State at home, they're at Washington. Then they got
You think they're going to do it? You have them as a win. Like, hey, Illinois, look at this. Galen's got faith in you, baby.
I picked Illinois before the season to beat Ohio State, and then I had them losing at Washington. They were part of this gaggle of teams that I had projected to go 10-2 and 7-2 in conference. But that's the thing. It would take Illinois looking better, and it would take Ohio State looking significantly worse. But I think if Illinois, if they can get their offense going like they did against Purdue and play better defense, they've got a shot. Ohio State's just very, very good. I'm going to pick Ohio State in that game, but that would be the route for Illinois. With Indiana, we've covered them over and over again. Iowa, believe it or not, is still kind of in the mix because when you look down their schedule, I mean, they can beat Wisconsin, they can beat Minnesota, but they've got to beat Penn State and Oregon, and then they got to go to USC. It's unlikely that they're going to come out of that with only one additional loss, let alone 0, especially with their quarterback being out. So I feel like we can sideline Iowa from the conference championship conversation at this point.
I will just, I'm going to go back to Illinois for a second. Like, and this is just, we're an IU podcast. We're all on the same page here. It would be funny if Illinois beats Ohio State. I would want like a 5-minute mea culpa from some people in the media to be like, hey, remember when you were just like, oh, well, Illinois must suck when they got blown out by Indiana? Like, can we go back and all the talk we heard last year about like, oh, one tough game, we didn't look like we can compete. Like, can we now admit that was a pretty goddamn good win against Illinois, against Indiana? Like, if Illinois beats Ohio State, it's just like, I want to take that win against Illinois is really starting to look like fine wine that's doing much better.
We're not going to get that.
I know, but it's just like, I would like that.
We're not getting it. But
you don't think there's a Paul Feinbaum section on ESPN where the guys, look, I got it wrong.
Yeah, that's I think that almost certainly. That's hilarious. Okay. Maryland, people have talked about, as you can see, I was not very high on Maryland this year, but they've exceeded expectations a bit. The thing is, ultimately, I think Maryland will find its level, so I think we can stop talking about them at this point.
Well, I think they were getting some run because people were doing, which I'm as guilty of as anybody else. You start looking at the schedule and you start like, oh, they're going to win that, they're going to win that, and suddenly it's like, oh wow, Maryland could be it was like if they beat Indiana, they could go undefeated, and it's like, well, like, but they were, to me, it was always based on them having a record, like they were going to be similar, I don't want to say the Indiana argument from last year, but like they would be there on a record basis of just like, hey man, they're undefeated.
But so much of that was built upon, wow, they've looked really impressive in these opening games. And those opening games were against Florida Atlantic, Northern Illinois, Towson, and Wisconsin. Who is truly bad this year. Michigan's the big interesting one to me because I had Michigan at 9-3. I still don't think Michigan's that great. And we're going to learn a ton about them when they travel to USC. Because, I mean, when you get right down to it, they largely were controlled by Oklahoma, and there's no shame in that. Oklahoma's a good team. They won a game that they could have lost at Nebraska, and they deserve credit for winning, but they weren't that impressive. And then they just beat an unimpressive Wisconsin team at home. So, again, much like with Maryland, it's like, okay, you've got to go to USC, and I'm very curious. Can Michigan play well enough to beat that USC offense, especially since USC can't stop anybody? They got Washington at home. That's not an easy game. They've got Ohio State at home. That's obviously not an easy game, even though Michigan's had the upper hand in that series recently. So again, with them, they're undefeated. They deserve a ton of credit, but they've got some games that are not walkovers as they move the rest of the way. I think they're in the mix, as you mentioned, Scott, but much as with Maryland, I would be careful about just counting wins automatically with that Michigan team, especially with a true freshman at quarterback.
Totally agreed. Although scroll back up real quick. They similarly look at the rest of their schedule outside of USC. Washington is mid-tier in the Big Ten right now. And again, we're very small sample size in the Big Ten, but it's like Michigan State's near the bottom, Purdue's near the bottom, Northwestern's near the bottom, Maryland, we'll see where they're at. They're going to have the win at Oklahoma is, sorry, they lost at Oklahoma. They're going to have a similar Big Ten profile if they lose at Ohio State to us last year, where it's like they played a lot of teams that were just not at the top of the Big Ten. And it's going to be frustrating again, because I don't think anyone's going to be like, Michigan's got to prove they're worthy of getting in. It's like even if they lose to Ohio State, they could probably still garner a college football playoff berth just based on the name and the record.
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, I hear that, and we've talked about it as a possibility. But again, as much as we complain about that as a possibility, it didn't happen for Alabama last year. There were a couple of other teams that didn't happen for last year. So I don't see Michigan being given a pass into the college football playoff with like 3 losses simply because their name is Michigan. When that does happen, we can complain. It hasn't happened yet.
Fair enough.
This next line, they're really in this group, I think, is only one team I would look at as truly a contender, but I am interested in how Ohio State's season goes, because having to travel to Illinois, having to play Penn State at home, and having to travel to Michigan, those are still 3 pretty tough games. They've looked really good so far, and I think the most impressive win that they've had has been the game at Washington. I didn't really think Minnesota was going to give them much of a game, and they didn't. But the fact they held Washington's offense down under the water so badly in that game, that's probably a really good defense. How does the offense perform when they play at Illinois? How do they perform when they play against Penn State? I'm really fascinated to see that. And then obviously the game at Michigan at the end of the year. Right now, I think Ohio State, it's tough with Ohio State, much as it's kind of tough with Oregon for a different reason. So much of reading Ohio State as the top team in the country is how much they dominated Texas, yet Texas looked terrible yesterday, as they have all season, in losing to Florida. So is that as good of a win? But also, is Ohio State just going to get gradually better like they do every year? That's going to be the open question there. So I don't know. That's obviously, I think if you're looking to get into the Big Ten title game and you're not Ohio State, you've got to be rooting for Illinois and Michigan as the teams that could knock off the Buckeyes moving forward. And frankly, there's like 5 or 6 teams that are going to be waiting for Ohio State to lose to somebody. I don't know if it actually happens, though, in the regular season.
The thing with Ohio State is I give them benefit of the doubt that most years they just don't, they do go clean. And like the games they lose would be a Michigan or, maybe the Penn State, but that game's at home, and they just don't lose games at home unless it's to Michigan. And that I know we're going to get to Penn State in a second. That's what was so surprising about this game with Penn State this weekend is, the rap on Penn State has been pretty the same, because it's like they win all those games. Like they win all the games they're supposed to. It's the ones they're not supposed to win that they have a hard time winning. Ohio State is that one team where I can give them benefit of the doubt to be like, I think they can go clean through the rest of the year, because every single year it feels like they do that. And, them losing at Wisconsin or at Purdue this year, or like home to UCLA, would just be something that happens once every 6 years. I mean, it's just something that really Ohio State just doesn't do.
Yeah. Looking down at the next column of teams, we've talked to Oregon. I did have Oregon losing at Penn State before the season started. Obviously, they win that. I do think the one question you have to ask, and this is, again, it's a similar question to what you asked with Ohio State. They've looked so good, but they've looked good against teams that may not actually be that top level. And so is winning in Happy Valley against this Penn State team, the way that they're playing, as impressive as it looked, much like is beating Texas at home in the first game of the season for Ohio State, as good as it looks? That becomes the open question. But again, Oregon, and I would actually argue Oregon's schedule is most conducive once you get past the Indiana game to this. That's a really tough game, I think, for Oregon, in as much as Indiana's demonstrated they can play defense, they can score, maybe not as consistently as Oregon or Ohio State, but against tougher competition, at least at the highest level. Like, there is no equivalent, at least in terms of how the teams are playing, of Indiana's win over Illinois on Oregon's schedule. And I think you can make an argument at this point very easily that Old Dominion is a better win than any other win Oregon's got on their schedule, which is kind of an interesting spot to be in. Same thing with Iowa. So Oregon the rest of the way, again, if they beat Indiana or even if they lose to them, the other teams that have a chance at doing something against them on the schedule are Iowa, who seems personnel-wise ill-suited to play a team like Oregon, USC, who has to go to Autzen, and then they got to go to Washington at the end of the year. That's a rivalry game, but there's no Michael Penix or Kalen DeBoer in this game. You got to like Oregon's chances. If they lose to Indiana, to run the table the rest of the way, and if they beat Indiana, that would be a demonstration to me that there isn't another team on their schedule that I'd be really concerned about if I were them.
Yep.
Penn State, we've talked about a couple of times now. I'm really fascinated. This was supposed to be the get-well game against UCLA, and I think it was like a 19.5-point spread.
24.5, I think, at one point.
You're right. It was a 24.5-point spread. So that doesn't look good at all. How do they handle Northwestern? I think they'll be fine at home. But, man, having to go at Iowa and go to Ohio State, the way they're playing right now, that's a team that can have 4 losses going into the Indiana game. It seems.
And this is something I talked about. I don't know if I talked to you about it. I was talking to someone else. I've been saying this for I was saying this before the UCLA game, is you'd obviously rather have that game against Penn State at home. Like, you'd rather have it at Memorial Stadium. That said, I was looking at this, they're probably going to lose to Ohio State. They could lose to Iowa, but if they, now they have 3 losses, that's a crowd in Happy Valley that's going to be on edge. If let's just say they lose to Ohio State, they have 3 losses coming in. That game against Indiana, they have to win that. That is, even if they win that, they might still be out of the college football playoff. That is the complete nail in the coffin. And that's something where if Indiana gets up 10-3 or 13-3, I don't know how intimidating that place is going to be. There will be boos. There will be people doing it'll be like the Boston crowds in the Red Sox in 2002. It's one of those where the home team could eat itself and the crowd could become a hindrance to the home team. And I felt that before they lost to UCLA. And this is all very real. And yeah, if they lose at Iowa and at Ohio State, that could be just a dead team walking.
Yeah, it's worth keeping an eye on, certainly, as we move forward with this. Not a lot of
Purdue.
Purdue, Rutgers, UCLA. We're going to keep off the mix. The other one I wanted to talk about, though, was USC, because I think they're the one other team that's kind of gotten left out of the equation. They have a real route, to, let's put it this way. If they beat Michigan, which is very possible, if they go to Notre Dame and they win, which, again, I think is possible given how good USC's offense is.
It would be nice to then finally put the nail in the Notre Dame coffin, because it's going to be super annoying with them at 10-2 trying to weasel a way in. 9-3 is going to be that's going to take mental gymnastics nobody can get over.
Right. And then they get Oregon on the road. This is one of those teams where USC will have it in front of them.
Right.
They've already lost 1 game in the Big Ten, but it's at Illinois. That's not going to be a bad loss at the end of the year. They really can't afford to lose again, as we've seen, if they want to have a shot at getting into the Big Ten title game. But I think that it's there for them if they can capitalize, because they don't have to play Ohio State. And while they are playing Oregon, Oregon's got to finish up with that game and then the game at Washington. I think that the whole thing's just kind of fascinating from the perspective of if they got it together, and I don't think they will, but they're a team to keep an eye on, just like Michigan is a team to keep an eye on as we move down the rest of this pathway here.
I mean, I kind of want to see you had a tab for buyouts. I wanted to see what you had there.
Well, it's funny because there was a lot of news about, not news, people saying fire James Franklin. This is Penn State fans that I follow on my
$50 million buyout, right?
It's $50 to $56 million buyout. And the one thing I'll say, and before we go to a break and come back and talk about the private equity stuff, because a lot of people are like, well, Cignetti, they'll go after Cignetti because he's from that area. And this is the math on that. Like, keep in mind that every athletic department is having to find $20 million extra dollars that they didn't have to pay for revenue sharing for athletes. That's just an automatic requirement. If you're Penn State, yes, you make more money than Indiana overall from a revenue perspective. Indiana pays assistant coaches more than Penn State does. One of the things that got missed in that whole discussion about Cignetti's extension last year was that Indiana was suddenly paying more in its assistant coach pool than Alabama. And that I think Ohio State was the only team in the Big Ten that they were trailing. So it's not even a question at this point of, well, hey, Penn State has to fire James Franklin, which they'd have to pay again between $50 and $56 million. Then they'd have to buy out Cignetti, which is another $13 million minimum. It may be more than that. Then they'd have to
increase their spend.
Then they'd have to increase their spend, not just on Cignetti's contract, because he's already making tons of money at IU. So what are you going to, he's making $8.5 million, and it's closer to $10 million in all terms of guaranteed in terms of like retention bonuses and whatnot. So what are you going to pay him? 14 or 15 million, and you're going to guarantee all of that for the next 8 years. And you have to buy out all of Cignetti's assistants because that's going to be a requirement, and then give them new deals that exceed the deals that they were going to get at Indiana.
Not to mention some NIL to bring over players that Cignetti's going to want to bring.
Like how much money do people think Penn State has?
Right.
And it's the same with Florida. It's the same with Alabama when there was talk about DeBoer maybe getting fired. The amount of money that it costs to do the things that a lot of these programs want to do is not feasible now when you're also asking the same donors to pay all of this money for players. I mean, there's only so many donors. I mean, unless you're Texas Tech or SMU.
Right.
And look why I was working with SMU. SMU's 3-2 on the season. I mean, there's no guarantee that your money's going to buy you success at this point.
And again, this is something that I've talked to people about when, it's like, oh, well, this is the year. Like, this is the year Cignetti's going to get poached by somebody else. And it's just like everything you mentioned it's like, again, we're all friends here. We're all IU fans. Like, it's just Cignetti's not going anywhere. I mean, and I think this is also where the age does help out. If he was like a 44-year-old coach, like, yeah, maybe he wants to go somewhere there's longer term. But it's like, if you're Cignetti, just to put this to bed too, it's like you're 64 years old. You go to Penn State, you like the pressure is different. Like what Cignetti's been able to do at a power, at a school like Indiana that has the resources of a top 10 school, he's built the equity that a Saban had at Alabama. I mean, IU's not doing anything, and he has the university around his finger. He's pushing them to make them pay more. Like, he's not going to have the same leverage at any school he goes to that he has at Indiana. So why would you leave that? Because again, he's also not going to leave here to go to UCLA or something, some low level program. So you're talking about Ohio State, Oregon, Miami, Penn State, those kinds of schools. They're not going to give a guy like that the kind of leverage. It's going to be, hey, we'll give you some money, and then you got to just get it done, and you got to get done fast. And if you're Cignetti, it's also like, do you want to rebuild that? Because there's a world where like Indiana could be in a better position than Penn State right now for the next 4 years based on the recruiting, the talent that we have, the money that we're bringing in NIL. So I think it's to me, it's very old way thinking of just, oh, well, someone's going to poach Cignetti. Like, that's not the way the world works anymore. And, this is, I think, what's interesting with college football today goes into our next conversation. Is just like things are different and the power structure is changing. And just because Indiana isn't a name like Penn State doesn't mean that it's actually might be a better job or just at the same level of job, or the economics just don't work for guys just like, oh, you immediately get poached.
Yeah. I mean, look, the big argument, and the argument I hear on national podcasts is, well, can you win a national title at Indiana? It's like, well,
If we beat
historically,
Oregon on Saturday, for sure as hell could.
well, that's the point. And that's the point. And
We're one game away.
and that's actually, I think, not the right argument to make. The right argument to make is, can you recruit at a championship level at Indiana? And I think you can now. Now it's going to take a while. And ultimately, even that is not the most direct way to ask the question. The question is, with resources, can you have the mix of portal access to players and developmental access to players where you can, put a roster together that's capable of competing at the highest level? And I think what you're seeing now is that there's several places in college football where you suddenly can do that, where you couldn't do that before. Like Vanderbilt probably should have won the game at Alabama if they didn't shoot themselves in the foot twice in the red zone in that game. That's a much different game coming down the stretch. Texas Tech is probably one of the best 10 teams in the country right now. That is not a place that you could have historically won a national title. It suddenly is. Indiana fits into that paradigm. There's a couple of others. So if you're an Indiana or a Texas Tech or a Vanderbilt, and you're willing to spend the money on assistants and facilities and the head coach, there's no reason why you can't accrue that talent. That's just something that a lot of people in college football, especially at the media level, have yet to get their heads wrapped around, because it's always been this vertically oriented structure in terms of coaching jobs and resources. And it's not quite that way, which is actually something that feeds directly into the thing we're going to talk about on the other end of this break. But the last thing I wanted to say before we get off of this topic, one of the things that Bill Connolly does with his S&P Plus, which hasn't been released yet, but will be here shortly, is he does a resume S&P Plus, which is essentially the S&P Plus version of strength of record, looking at how you've performed against the teams that you've played against. And I want to note that this week, and I'm going to pop it up here on screen, the CFP projection based solely on resume S&P Plus has Indiana as the number 1 overall seed, Ohio State is the number 2 overall seed, Oregon is the number 3 overall seed, and Texas Tech is the number 4 overall seed, with the rest of the roster of the games being Miami, Oklahoma, Ole Miss, Mizzou, Texas A&M, Memphis, BYU, and Alabama.
By the way, speaking of money, what do I need to pay to make that the bracket right now? Like, I'll take that right now.
What a future that would be. Anyway, we'll be right back after this as we'll talk about the changing financial landscape of college football, college sports in general, and what it might mean for Indiana and others.
If you're not listening to Sideline Stories with Trisha Whitaker and Sydney Parrish, you're missing great stories like this.
When you interviewed Cignetti, did you know that he was the type of character that he is, and so outspoken and just like what we call a soundbite machine?
No, not really, but I did realize in the first phone conversation how he was just so authentic. Literally at the end of the conversation, I'll never forget it. And I thought about Coach Knight a little bit, because I'd heard that people asked Coach Knight when he took the Indiana job, and they'd say, "Why did you go to Indiana?" And he said, "Because I could win there." So I'm on the phone with Coach Sig, and at the end, I said, "Do you think you could win here?" And he said, "Scott, let me just tell you this. If I have average resources, I will win. Trust me." I remember thinking, I believe it. I really did. And I remember hanging up, and I called President Whitten. I said, "Hey, I just finished up with Coach Cignetti," and I said, "Hey, I think he's different."
Sideline Stories is part of the Back Home Network. Subscribe on YouTube and Spotify.
Welcome back to CrimsonCast, part 2 or section 2 of the show, perhaps. Just a reminder, Sideline Stories available in the Back Home Network YouTube channel, as well as many of our other programs, including the Dribble Drive covering college women's basketball, the Doing the Work podcast covering Indiana women's basketball, and the Big Red Carpet with Rhett Lewis, which will be coming back to you tomorrow as Rhett takes on the challenge of previewing Indiana versus Oregon. All right. So one of the things that we have seen bubbling to the surface recently, Scott, has been this whole idea of what happens financially with some of these different conferences and college football in general. There was a report that came out earlier this week that the Big Ten and Commissioner Tony Petitti have been, and I'm quoting from the Athletic article, exploring potential partnerships with private capital companies, i.e. private equity, for about a year. They may decide by the end of October about whether or not to strike a deal. There's some conversations going back and forth. And essentially what we're talking about here is a report from ESPN that happened on Wednesday that said this deal would be tied to sponsorship and branding rights being bundled together and could bring in upwards of $2 billion, which would be distributed amongst the 18 members, the conference office, and then a new entity called Big Ten Enterprises. It would entail a grant of rights for all of the teams in the conference being extended for the next 20 years through the 2046 season. It would not extend the television contracts that the conference has with Fox and other networks. So this got a lot of attention, and it ties in with some other things going on in college football. It's hard to know exactly where to stand on this in terms of we don't know all the details. One of the things that got mentioned within this report that there might be tiered revenue distributions within the conference where teams that bring in greater ratings and revenue would get more money than others. We've heard some noise that Ohio State and Michigan in particular have been pushing for larger shares of the pie in terms of equal distribution of revenue. This has become a common thread across other conferences as well. It's all part of this larger issue with not just the funding and the financial foundation of college sports, but also this whole idea of how do you do this in an era where college athletics is not geared to handle the amount of money that they're going to have to distribute at this point. So, Scott, you saw this news. You wanted to do a little podcast on it. I mean, and I know that you're not as versed in this area as some of the people that write about it regularly, but your initial feeling when you saw this story came out was what?
It would be funny when you're saying we think it's Ohio State and Michigan who are at. It'd be funny if it was and Rutgers also wants a better, if it's the Rutgers is we also want a bigger slice of the pie when we do this distribution. I at first was like, wow. And on one hand, it's this seems like the next inevitable step. But my initial high level thoughts when I read through it, and I would urge everyone to read the Athletic article. I read the ESPN blurb, and it's provides nothing.
It was basically a badly written press release.
Yeah. The Athletic at least provides some information here, but my main takeaways are kind of three different things. Four. I'll go with the four, and then we can kind of dig in as you want to see fit. One is, the unequal distribution of revenue. Right now it's always been with the conferences that, every team gets the same share. So everyone gets an equal stake. And, you've often wondered, when is Ohio State and Michigan going to bucket that? When are they going to be cool sharing the same amount with an Indiana or a Northwestern? What I think is interesting is what no one's really talked about is, this private equity firm that would put money in would also get a share. And once you open the door to unequal share distributions, there's no reason why that private equity firm is going to be we're cool with the 1/20th too. It's very possible they come in and they're hey, it's going to be Ohio State, Michigan, and us. Right. and then in a couple of years, it's going to be us and then Ohio State and Michigan. Private equity firms normally don't come in and play nice. They come in and they break a bunch of stuff and then they make the most return out of anybody. So I thought that was interesting. The two other things that I took away is that first off, it's we're kind of the last couple of years, you and I have been looking at, or others have been looking at the ACC as man, they're screwed because they got this grant of rights. They're just stuck under this grant of rights. They can't do anything. And then you just hear the Big Ten be well, we're going to also get another 20-year grant of rights. What are things going to look like in 20 years, man? That's a long time to lock stuff in for money right now. So that's the last. Then the last thought is that it's this is where it gets really murky and interesting, and we're just really plowing into a new area. And the Athletic hits this is, all the universities in the Big Ten are public. It's two private, but the rest of them are all public universities. These are public. You can't just sell part of IU to a private equity firm. You could, I guess, sell the media rights of it, and then the Big Ten is a nonprofit entity. So you have this collection of public entities, fire departments. These are public universities that are owned by the states, controlled by a nonprofit. And now you're bringing in a private equity firm to kind of run and be part of this. It's a an unbelievably odd mismatch of pieces. And normally, again, I'll just go back to it. Like I like business history. Every time private equity comes into it as a normal for-profit business, things drastically change. But that private equity firm's job, like a KKR, they make money. Like that is their job, is to turn things around. Sometimes it helps the business, sometimes it doesn't. The fact that they're coming into this world, I think it's a little bit naive for the Big Ten and these universities who they're not in the for-profit world. They're bringing in massive streams of revenue, but to just be like, we're going to let this tiger in the playpen, I think it's a recipe for a real issue in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of things I think that need to be taken into account with all of this. And I think everything you said is it's a set of valid points. And I'm not here to advocate for this idea because I don't know really, still don't have the schematics of what it would look like. They haven't been released yet. But I think there's some mitigating or at least consideration factors that we need to have in the mix. So you're right. You've got 16 public institutions and 2 private institutions, Northwestern and USC, within this mix. They are already taking pieces of what you would consider their university and giving them to another entity, in this case, the Big Ten, who in turn has packaged those deals and sold them, or packaged that inventory, in this case, the rights to games, the rights to broadcast games, not just in football, but in all sports, package those to network partners who are private entities and who have exercised great control over when games are taking place, as we've heard already in the last year and a half of this new television deal that the Big Ten has. People complaining about Michigan State having to go to USC and play a game that starts at
11:30 Eastern,
11:30 Eastern, or 11 o'clock Eastern, or the opposite. Teams having to go from west to east and play at 9 a.m. body time. Ohio State complaining that their games are constantly getting stuck in the big noon kickoff spot. Why? Because Fox wants it there. Why? Because they can sell and make more money off the advertising. So you're right. And the people that bring up the idea that these are public institutions, you had Jordan Acker, the very outspoken Michigan regent or member of the Board of Regents, saying we shouldn't be selling the assets of our public university to this private entity. It's like, you're already doing that. I'm sorry, you've been doing that for years.
That's fair.
The way the Big Ten Network was set up was a partnership between the Big Ten and its member institutions who own percentages of the Big Ten Network and Fox, who they are in partnership with. That's how the Big Ten Network is. It's not a situation like ESPN and the SEC and the SEC Network, where the SEC Network is owned 80% by ESPN/Disney and 20% by Hearst Television, and then they pay the SEC for their rights. The Big Ten Network is owned by the schools. It's owned by the conference collectively, and then also owned by Fox. So you've already broached this territory to some degree. Now, the question is, if you give a private equity company a share of what is essentially a television rights, sponsorship, and an inventory company, what does that mean in terms of their overall effect? You're talking about the way that this is described, there would be 1/20th of a vote. This deal essentially rests on a couple of ideas. Idea one is that college athletics, and particularly college athletics like the Big Ten, is actually very undervalued in terms of what you're getting out of the marketplace. And there's a real good argument to be made for that, because the market value of the contracts has largely been dictated by the network partners. Fox has decided how much they're going to pay to the Big Ten. The other network partners are then going off of whatever inventory is available based upon what Fox is already taking. And yet, even within that, Fox has gone out of their way, as has ESPN, to ensure that all of these rights deals are coming due at different times. And what I mean by that is the SEC's media deal gets renegotiated. ESPN ensures that when that occurs, they're not dealing with an
bidding
open
against each
market.
other. Yeah.
They're not bidding against Fox for those rights necessarily. Just like Fox is ensuring that when those deals come open, it's just the Big Ten rights. It's not also the Big Ten and the SEC rights. And so you've already got a situation that's played out, even with CBS and NBC jumping into the mix with the Big Ten. You've already got a situation in place where the rights are a bit undervalued and the rights are unevenly distributed. One of the big complaints that CBS and especially NBC have had over the course of this deal with the Big Ten is that Fox is getting all the really good games. They're getting all the games with the top brands, whereas CBS and NBC have struggled. NBC has kind of stumbled in to this Oregon-Indiana game, which is a great game, but it's still not going to bring in the numbers that an Ohio State game against a really good opponent would be. Yes, NBC had Ohio State against Minnesota last night, and we'll have to see what the ratings were, but they would not have been as good as the ratings for, say, Ohio State, Michigan on NBC. But that's not a possibility because Fox has made sure that they've got those games under their umbrella. So you are talking about a situation where even though there's a partnership that the Big Ten has right now with Fox as the primary partner, not just with Big Ten Network, but with their overall inventory, Fox has maneuvered themselves into a point where the rights values are probably undervalued because it's Fox ultimately dictating the inventory and how much it's worth, not the Big Ten dictating the inventory to Fox. I think that that's a really interesting and important distinction here.
Yeah.
So a lot of this is predicated on the idea that the rights are undervalued and that they will continue to go up in value because they are currently undervalued. And everything we're seeing this year with ratings across the board, not just with Big Ten games, but elsewhere, indicates that actually, yeah, that may be right. You may have actually you're not generating as much money because the ratings keep going up. You keep seeing higher and higher levels of audiences interested in college football as you're getting more marketing. And this was the big thing with the Big Ten. It's like, gosh, instead of being locked into Fox, if we take the NFL approach and market across all of these different networks, it's going to naturally raise the visibility. Whereas ESPN, like CBS used to have the SEC, they don't anymore. Right. Now it's on one network. And I think you could make the argument that that really does hurt you in this environment, even though it's more inconvenient for fans. The idea that you've got premier games on other networks exposes you to a broader audience of people.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that I'm curious about is how this factors into future expansion, because, if you're looking to bring in Clemson or Florida State or Notre Dame, that always gets talked about, suddenly that was always the idea, is like, you come into the Big Ten, you're Notre Dame, you get assume they go to 20 teams, you get a 1/20th share. You're now going to get a 1/21st share because there's going to always be a +1. The difference is all the schools today would get the benefit of the payout. That $2 billion investment would go to Indiana, Illinois. Like, you're Notre Dame, you come in, you're not getting that, and you're also getting a lesser share. But again, maybe because the breadth of the Big Ten is enough that that becomes the conference to go for. It's going to be interesting because you're right. If they're able to market it more, it just becomes like, all right, this is now really the premier conference. I just, I hate being the old guy, or it's not, I wish it was the old way. It's just like you're really barreling into just becoming a professionalized sport, which I know it is. Like, I'm not trying to say like it should be amateurism. It's just, it's still not a professional sport. These are not professional organizations. I mean, like, they are still universities. For as much as you say that they have sold things off, which is all true, it's like they're still public universities. They're still, they're not part of a governed organization that really works together, and it's still run by a nonprofit. Whereas like the Pacers are a professional team, part of a professional league, who at the core, its goal is to make money. And at its core, that's not really what college is supposed to be. I just, I hear everything you're saying. Like, it all makes sense. Like, we just keep going and going, but it's like, at some point it feels like this is going to take a step too far. And in the end, it's like the private equity, they're not going to be the ones who are going to be cool being like, all right, well, we'll ask donors for more money to figure this out. Like, they will suck this thing dry to get their returns.
Yeah, but I mean, again, that's probably true. But I'll note that what you're already seeing in college athletics is this playing out in various spots. And I'll take again, the idea that we're bringing in, external entities, private entities to manage things. It's like that's already happened.
Yeah.
Like Learfield, who manages signage, digital content, athletic broadcasts like coaches shows, they already have deals across the country with all of these. They're actually being asked by athletic departments to now manage NIL in the exact same way.
It's a fine line, but it's like you're hiring them to do a job. I hear you. You're outsourcing, you're hiring them, but you're not you're not taking money from Learfield, who now wants a 10x return.
But here's the problem. What people say they like, and again, not advocating for this,
Right.
but I am saying we need to consider some of these things. People say that they like non-revenue sports that are not generating revenue, sports that are not highlighted as key sports within conferences. The Big Ten highlighted 4 primary sports within its spectrum of sports that they sponsor as ones they were going to focus on moving forward: football, men's basketball, women's basketball, and volleyball. And by the way, huge shout out to Steve Aird and the IU volleyball team. They go on the road and they sweep the LA teams this weekend. They win at USC. They win at UCLA. They're almost certainly going to be ranked this upcoming week. Think about all the sports that Indiana is proud of that aren't those 4 sports. Men's soccer being a great example. Baseball has been a team that's been, become a lot more part of the normal or the core elements of what we think of as IU athletics here lately. Swimming and diving has won multiple national titles. Where is the money going to come from to support these programs? Because now you're having to pay $20 million a year plus in the first year to athletes, and that will almost certainly go up. You're still having to pay coaches very, very high salaries, and there's no legal way to cap that. As much as people are like, well, coaches shouldn't make this much money or assistant coaches shouldn't make, like, that's what the professional market is in those areas. So somehow that's also exempted from the conversation about this is amateur athletics and what are we running. Teams, athletic departments are going to run out of money. Many of them already have. We just saw Virginia Tech had to throw $230 million at their athletic department because they took a look at what they were doing and they were like, we're risking complete irrelevancy if we don't do something. That money runs out after a while. Donor money runs out after a while. There's so much money coming in these television contracts, but it has to go to support everything else. And at this point, the budgets don't work in a way unless there's a complete restructuring of how every athletic department in the country does things. So my question is, if you want those things to remain, where is the money coming from? Because saying, well, we're just not going to pay our next coach that much money. Well, I would invite you to look at what happened to UCLA, who tried that approach. They tried to take the hometown discount on an alum who wanted to coach there, and they looked up until this weekend like the worst team in the Big Ten. So where does the money come from? You've gotten yourself into a position where the entire structure of college athletics, the amateur structure that people thought existed but didn't really, rested on the idea that you never had to pay the labor anything. Well, that's out the window now. And it's not like you've got money magically dropping out of the sky in terms of tickets, in terms of other revenue. All that's been, to some degree, managed about as well as it can by the structure of college athletics. You people would be shocked at the relatively small number of people that work professionally in athletic departments across the country. The amount of people that you would want, go look at an NFL mascot, just an NFL team, and look at the amount of people professionally working for them, not the coaches, but look at them too, but the rest of the front office. And then go look at the equivalent version of a college athletic department managing all of these sports. There's not money, there's not people. At some point, you have to find a different model, or you have to essentially just give up on the model existing as it currently, is. I don't like this route. I am struggling to think of other plausible routes where you maintain at least some control and still maintain what people think of as college athletics.
Yep. No, I hear you again. Like, I'm not advocating one way or either way. It's just, the answer is probably you need to like restructure these things better, because this answer is just like, well, this system doesn't work without more money. So we just got to find ways to get more and more and more money. And it's like this is where I just get a little bit concerned. It feels like, once you start bringing in these partners that are looking for returns, that you're not hiring them, you're not selling media rights, they are investing in you and they're giving you money. That's kind of the next Rubicon that you're passing. And and you're kind of, what's funny is, it's not like this is going to solve all the problems. This will put a patch on it. This will throw some money at it for a couple years.
Well, yeah.
And then you need to do it again. And then it's like, then you're going to have to go to a Saudi money fund. And then it's like, then you're just going to run out of funds. Then it's like, this system will implode at some point where it's like,
I don't know that it'll implode. I think the idea is if you go to private equity and you say, we're going to give you the rights to our athletic department in exchange for X, Y, and Z, that's different than this proposal. And this is where, when that was being talked about with like Florida State, and they were going to try to go to some sovereign wealth fund kind of thing, which, I mean, that's what you're talking about. I just think this is a different model. And I'm not saying it's a model that will work, but if you're going to do it, you would want to do it in a way where there was a limited amount of actual trade-off for the control versus the money. Because ultimately
it's funny. It's like, if Ohio State's pissed now that they're not getting the right games, it's like, this fund is going to have an outsized vote. I mean, if it's like
no, I don't think so. I mean, that's not how this is structured, the way it's being talked about. I mean, you're making it like there's a ton of assumptions that can be made.
Right.
The idea that this suddenly becomes the only voice in the room, I don't know if I necessarily buy that, because and maybe, but this is where, if you're college athletics and you're thinking about going this direction, the better option in terms of how you structure things moving forward is acknowledging that you're in a professionalized model and that you need to pay people directly. They need to be unionized. You get around a lot of things that way. But the reason why we're going down this pathway, I have less of a problem with the private equity part as it's presented here, even though the private equity part is certainly not something you want to bring into the mix. I have a much larger problem with the idea that, well, instead of acknowledging the business realities we're in terms of the relationship with the athletes and the amount of money that we have and how we want to manage this, instead of fully professionalizing it, which we need to do because that's what it is, that is implied in the amount of money that you're bringing in, as you mentioned. Instead of doing that, and instead of actually sitting down with the other people in college athletics, the SEC, and saying, we really need to start over and restructure this, acknowledging the legal and financial world that we are in now. Instead of doing that, they're going this route, which is, well, we want to maintain this nebulous system that we've got where we're not acknowledging that these are athletes that can unionize and who need to be collectively bargained with, which, by the way, is how professional sports operate everywhere else. You've even got now, this Texas Tech booster, it's Cody Campbell, who's going around talking about, well, what they need to do is repeal or amend the amend the Sports Broadcasting Act of 1961. There was actually supposed to be a commercial that was going to air this weekend that was spiked by the networks. And essentially what Cody Campbell comes in and says is to conference commissioners, quoting directly from the commercial, to conference commissioners, it's all about money and control. Their greed is bankrupting all but the biggest schools, and women's sports and Olympic programs everywhere are paying the price. The idea being that, athletic departments are losing money, and what we need to do is amend this Sports Broadcasting Act, which, just to inform everybody about what this is and what it does, it is not normal for entities to be able to pool and collectively bargain rights away in media the way that the NFL does, the way that Major League Baseball does, the way that the NBA does. The NFL is kind of the most curious case of this because they pool all of their rights and then they turn around and sell those rights to network partners. It's not too different from what the Big Ten has done, but the difference is it's just the Big Ten doing it. It's not the whole of college football. College football used to have a collected rights that they would bargain to network partners. That was the situation that was shot down by the Board of Regents decision in 1984, where Oklahoma and a couple of other schools sued, basically saying the NCAA has all of the rights to all of the college football games, and they don't sell nearly enough of them. They don't get nearly enough money. We should be allowed to sell these rights individually. And that's exactly what happened, which is why you have Big Ten only rights being sold. It's why you have SEC rights only being sold. It's why Notre Dame goes out and sells their rights all by themselves. Like, that's why there's that difference. The big question mark in all of this, and you know, why I think you have to bring this into the conversation about the private equity issue, is I don't know that Cody Campbell is right, that somehow allowing college athletics in general to pool and sell its television rights to networks is really the big fix that he thinks that it is. Because are those packages worth more individual? I mean, if you think about each of these conferences at this point, what they're selling in terms of depth of inventory across basketball and football is probably more inventory than what the NFL can provide. It's certainly more than what the NBA provides generally. It's definitely more than what Major League Baseball provides on a national level. I don't know that there's this big pot of gold at the end of the rainbow with that. So, you know, it's a questionable avenue, but it is interesting that the networks were like, we're not going to run those ads, because it just so happens that the networks are the ones benefiting from the current structure. It's just, the whole thing's fascinating, but it goes back to a core issue, which is that college athletics is going to need money from somewhere to keep going. And there does not appear to be an appetite for sitting down and actually making changes to the structure of college sports amongst the people that run college sports. So you're either going to be trying to get more money from television networks indirectly, or trying to get more from them directly. Either way, you're going to need outside entities to come in and manage this, because colleges and universities and conferences right now are not capable of running it. And so that's where the route you take, there's probably going to be pitfalls regardless. I am just curious which of those routes ends up being the least damaging.
Yeah, no, you're right. And that's my concern with the pitfall here, is like, this is all happening because of everything you laid out, that it's like the colleges are having trouble dealing with the financial aspects of this. And as you said, they're not able to manage it. And I just think it's funny, like, a lot of these universities want more control over what's happening. It's like this, I view this as like, this is not the way to get control. Like, normally when you do these, you know, when you start doing private equity money and you start getting companies buying into other companies, like it's normally you're going to start doing measures for short-term gain and to get those investment results. And so this might solve the problem for a little bit, but my question's going to be in year 3, 4, or 5, you know, this private equity firm, sure, they say they're going to get a 1/20th vote. Maybe they do, but how are things going to be if the money still has some issues in year 4 or 5 and they're not getting the return they wanted? What is it going to look like? Because again, it is different selling something than taking money. The minute you start taking investors, like, that $2 billion check is going to have some outsized pieces in there, and they're going to want that return. And these are companies that, you know, when you start doing this stuff, it's like, again, go look at KKR. They've taken over hundreds of companies and they've driven a lot of them into the ground, and just being like, you know what, we're going to change course, and we're just going to cut employees and just short-term gain, put a bunch of debt, and we're going to move on to the next thing. And you know, as long as they get their return, that's all this equity firm really cares about. They don't care about, you know, Ohio State's game times. They don't care about this getting better. So I agree with you. Like, I would go for a different route. I just am concerned that this is a little bit, you know, you just said it. It's like, these are most people running, you know, college athletics kind of backed into this huge moneymaker, and they were not built to do this. Most of the people running this are not running hedge funds and doing high level business deals. You're now letting some people into the door who do that. That would be my concern, is like, how are we going to manage these people in our group? Because they have vastly different interests than what we have. As crazy as we think college athletics is, it's like there is still kind of a tangible, like, we're still trying to help the non-producing sports, and like, we're doing it in a totally jacked up way. And they're trying to make money, but it's like, and there's a bowl system. Everything's kind of weird, but it's like, at the end, it's like they're still trying to keep, you know, some kind of semblance of a sport at an amateur level, or a quote unquote amateur level. You start bringing private equity groups in, and I'm being very, you know, painting with a broad brush here, but it's like they don't give a crap about any of that stuff. It's like, are we getting the return we wanted? And if we don't want that return, we're willing to break anything. Like anything is off the table, whether it's like we're going to cut all sports or we're just going to have, USC play all road games. It's just like all of it's on the table if it gets us our return. And so that would be my concern, is our conference going down this road. And honestly, making a mistake, and maybe it's like the SEC goes a different route. And that would be my concern, is like, did we pick the right route? Maybe we did. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's ultimately, to me, the biggest thing is you've got to start taking this seriously as a business if you're the Big Ten or the SEC.
Yeah.
You can't act like one thing and do another, which is what's been attempted here over the course of the last 25 years. You can't, and this is where the universities, some of them, I think more than others, have to get fully on board with the idea that whatever they thought they were managing is no longer what they were managing. Trying to pretend like you're managing something that you're not is a horrific idea that has real consequences. And again, I'll go back to what I've said from the beginning. We've been talking about rearrangement and reorganization of college sports for years now. I'll go back to what I've said from the beginning, which is that all of these things are marketing tools for your university. They are ways, when your football team plays well, it is as good, if not the best, way to market your school to potential students and their parents. And as much as people in higher ed don't want to admit it, a good football team, a good basketball team makes your campus more appealing to a much larger number of people across the country. And that's why these things are ultimately so important. It engages your alumni, it engages your donors. It becomes a thing that you can't live without. And that's where, for the schools in the Big Ten, like if the question was going to be, why would you even think about doing this deal with a private equity firm who would be giving this money and expecting a return? The twofold answer is because it provides us a modicum of control over what we're doing with sponsorship, even though your argument is if you bring private equity and you're losing control. I think the argument here is if the contractual setup of the thing is structured properly, you actually can maintain control, because ultimately you are tying in something that has tangible value that is tied to the relative strength of the whole entity, which is 18 separate sub-entities that are collectively covering the entire country, that there's clearly a growth curve that you're still experiencing, and that's not likely to go anywhere given everything we've seen about how college athletics is trending in terms of the top line audience interest. Now, do you run risks with that? Yes. And that's where I think other models need to be continually explored. You also run the risk, as we were talking about earlier, about Ohio State, Michigan, whoever, saying, well, we deserve a bigger piece of the pie simply because of who we are and who we've been. The flip side of that risk, though, is that right now, with the House settlement and with the new structure of college sports, you are already in a really bad situation in terms of management and control and what the business actually operates in. And this is where we can criticize these organizations and these entities all that we want for even having this being on the table. But they have backed themselves into a corner over the course of the last several years, really the last 3 decades, by creating a system that relied entirely on judicial or congressional intervention or protection to keep the system alive. Yeah. And it's gone now. And it's like, again, you don't have a lot of great options here. If this is the most controllable of a set of bad options, that's probably why it's on the table. But it certainly doesn't mean it's a good option. I just don't know if it's the worst option. And that's, I guess, that, it's been anything with PE has been indicated as the worst option by most of the commentators. But the flip side is, if you can really create this Big Ten enterprises and you can really limit the consolidation of power to that 1/20th vote, and you're getting money on the front end because this is a guaranteed investment in the eyes of whatever the investors are. It's not like it'd be any better if the Big Ten went public. It's like we've seen public entities in very bad situations as well, because stockholders, much like private equity firms, are only interested in whatever return they're getting. And you've also got a situation right now where your institutions are being impacted by decisions that your private partners, in this case, the networks, are already making on behalf of you. I'm not saying it's a good deal. I'm saying there's not a good deal right now.
Well, and it's funny, like
the
the
least
deal
worst bad deal at this stage.
the deal that probably makes the most sense, which like I'm firmly going to say is not going to happen. This makes zero sense, but it's like if the NCAA and the universities listen to what they were saying, that's the best deal. Is like, let's start wheeling this back, take less money, and just keep this more of an amateur type sport. You can still be on TV. You could still pay the players. You could still have all the other non-revenue producing sports, but it's like you have to turn the spigot off a little bit and like stop. I know. I mean, I know it's not.
I know.
I know it's not going to happen, but it's like if you admit like, hey, we're not set up to be a professionalized sport. Like that's what the professionalized sports are. We're something different. So we're going to take, we'll take some money. We're not going to take as much. We're not going to say yes to everything. And we're going to try and build a structure where we can, take enough to get all this done that we want to get done, but realize that, we're not here to maximize all the TV money. But it's like, they can't do that. No one says no to more money. But that's what's funny is like the real solution here is just be what you want to be, which is an amateur sport that, can make some money and be there. But it's like, this is why the Big Ten is a nonprofit. And this is why these member universities are public entities. Like none of this is set up to be a for-profit system. And if they just treated it as such, that it would, by continuing to say yes and continuing to maximize as much money as they can, like a for-profit system, they are in this situation that you are right. But it's like, that is a stupid argument that I'm making because nobody's going to be like, we'll take less money in our revenue deal. But that's probably what they should do.
Well, and it also goes, look, there's so many problems with the system that were created to try to hide the system behind this veil of amateurism,
right,
which doesn't exist as a legal definition anywhere in the United States, isn't used elsewhere in athletics for a reason. Yeah, and again, what you've done over the course of time in order to justify not paying football players and basketball players, which you now have to do if you want to compete, not just through NIL, but through revenue sharing. You've made the argument over and over again that a rowing team member and a football player are the same in terms of their status. And you either have to stop saying that because it's never really been true, and then you have to figure out where the bar is, where that ceases being true within your athletic department. And realistically, it's like, I mentioned those 4 sports that the Big Ten is supporting. That's the cut line as far as the Big Ten's concerned.
Right.
How far further down you go, you either have to stop doing that or you have to go find more revenue sources. Like there's really no options there.
No, you're right.
And so again, what you're dealing with, this is the painful molting of college sports from its previous skin to wherever it's going. And again, it's hilarious to me because like 25, 30 years ago, there was this sense amongst college athletics and the NCAA that, well, things have gotten out of control. There's too much money in the system. You know how we're going to fix it? We're going to put college presidents in charge of all of this. They're going to be the ones making the decisions because they're going to look out for the best interests of the academics of the institutions. And what's hilarious, Miles Brand becomes the NCAA chairman, and we're going to put the focus back on academics. And that group of people, presidents, Miles Brand, Steve, Mark Emmert, like that's the group. Mark Emmert was also a former college president. This is the group that created this immense commercial expansion.
They turned the spigot on for all the money.
It's just, and yes, all of it happened right when television changed and became more digital and you had far more potential audience members out there. But it's just, this is the same group that's still walking around talking about amateurism.
Right.
And they're not amateurs anymore. They never were. But just because and this is the big problem with all of this, because you've said this long enough, you're scared to death of having to go back to your faculty and to the people who bought this for years, including many fans, and say, actually, no, these are professionals. We're running a professional entity. That's the situation everybody finds themselves in at this point. So this thing is intriguing to me. I want to see more details. even, and I will say this, like even the unequal distribution of revenue, I mean, that's what you've got now to some degree. Yes, technically the television contracts are the same, but schools like Ohio State and Texas are generating significantly more revenue than their counterparts in their own conferences at this point. It's already a relatively uneven system. What you need is rules that say everybody has to play by the same rules. That's the thing you've got to get to if you want to make this work. That's the thing that can only happen if you actually sit down as a group and talk through this. But there's going to have to be some changes that you're uncomfortable with. I just wish they'd take that leap rather than keep continuing to throw things on top of the pile,
I know,
which is what this PE thing is, this private equity thing is. And I don't, unfortunately, that seems to be the only direction that people are willing to go.
Right.
So anyway,
Yeah.
All right. I think it's going to wrap it up for us. Any final thoughts from you?
No, I mean, all right. I don't want to dig into it one more time. But my other question I had when I saw this that I want to ask you, so we can make it a quick answer, is there's so many questions here, but do you think this deal makes it more, less, or the same likely that the Big Ten expands? Because that was my other. Sorry, we went deep. Like that was my other question. Is like, does this other entity having a share? Does it mean that like, yeah? How do you think this impacts Big Ten possible expansion in the future?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that the part of the comments of this deal were that it was going to be the same 18 teams doing this grant of rights until 2046. I think it makes it less likely that there would be expansion.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think some of this conversation is intended to put the squeeze on
Notre Dame,
not just Notre Dame, but Florida State, Clemson, because I think what you have to look at it from the flip side, which is as much as the control dangers around private equity are legitimate, the flip side of it is the issues regarding not having as much money as the other teams is a real concern.
yeah, it's just as much of a risk. Yeah.
And so like the reason why Florida State and Clemson withdrew their lawsuits to get out of the ACC was that they were guaranteed more money. They'll still make less money than the lower tiered teams in the Big Ten under this deal.
Yeah.
And what incentive does anybody in the Big Ten have at this point to going and bringing those teams in if you're not really getting that much of a revenue boost or a ratings boost out of adding them? It has to either be a sponsorship situation to bring someone in, but it would also have to be a situation where someone would have to be willing to take less money in order to come in, because that's essentially been the deals we've seen elsewhere. So at this stage, I think the SEC, as much as we assume Florida State, Clemson, Notre Dame are going to be automatically put into these things because they have value, I think we are getting to a point where you start looking at future projections. I don't know if the value is actually there to bring those teams in. So I actually think a deal like this would make it less likely there would be further expansion, not more.
Okay.
So I don't know. It's going to be fascinating to see what happens. So, all right, let's solved
it.
We solved it. All good. All done. We will be back maybe later today. Talk polls. We'll also have plenty of programming later on in the week, including a preview of IU Oregon here on CrimsonCast, a preview on Big Red Carpet, and some other goodies, hopefully, as well as CrimsonCast coming out on Thursday. For Scott, I'm Galen. This is CrimsonCast. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.